I want to just take a moment to lay out what we might talk about, and then make some form out of the chaos that's here. A little bit of form. So I think what we're going to cover is we're going to start with relations, and then we're going to deal with this word a bit, and then this word, and then this word. And our friends on this journey are going to be Chief William Commanda, Annie Quirk, Oren Lyons. Oren Lyons is Iroquois. Annie Quirk is Inuk. William Commanda is Algonquin. And when we get to religion, we'll be relying on a little bit on Timothy Fitzgerald. Sorry, I'm forcing you folks to go through this. I should have written this ahead of time. What's Tomoko? How do I spell Tomoko's last name? Tomoko. Masuzawa. And then we get to resources. We'll be relying on Leanne Simpson and Dwayne Donald. Dwayne is Cree. Leanne is Nishnabik. And we'll also, I think we'll probably also rely on Naomi Klein. And when we get to reweaving, I think we'll leave that one for a bit of a surprise. I think when we get to resources, we'll also, I'm just going to put it here just to remind myself, we're going to refer to a Norwegian, Niels Christie. And just so that I remember to mention it, we'll also touch on hydroponics, but not how you think. Okay, so thanks for enduring that little exercise in writing. I'm going to start with a story. And I'm actually going to start with Annie's story. Do I have to stay here, or can I move around? Raisa, can I move around, or do I have to stay here? Oh, there's a camera back there, right? I have to stay within the camera range? Yeah. Okay.
Stay behind those speakers.
Stay behind the speakers. Okay. All right. Good. I need some room to roam.
What if I put this so that don't go over that line, beyond that line?
Don't go past that line. All right. I'll stay right here. Good. All right.
The other end is here.
Okay. Awesome. This is my cell. All right. This will be a very organic presentation. It's going to have a very naturalistic feel to it. It won't feel at all artificial or stilted. Okay, good. Annie, when I started working at Nunavut Tungavik, which is an Inuit organization that represents the Inuit of Nunavut, and Nunavut is 1/5 of Canada, the top fifth, the Arctic. One of the people who was working there when I started was Annie Quirk. She's Inuk, and she, like many Inuit working there, spends a fair bit of time teaching white people about how weird white people are. And I was one of her students who learned about the weirdness of white people from her. And Annie told a story about Nunavut. You have to realize has, I just want to get this out of my way here, put it there, has 25 communities, and there are no roads, and you have to fly into them all. And they're spread across the top 1/5 of Canada, so it's a massive space. It's the largest land claim in the world. So when the federal government in Canada wants to consult Inuit people about an idea or a policy change on something, they spend a lot of money on Twin Otter small aircraft, and they fly a set of high-priced consultants and government people into each of the 25 communities so that they can at least check the box and say they asked Inuit if they were doing the right thing. And on one of these trips, the federal government had decided that it was going to restructure home care for the elderly. And they needed a kind of designated Inuk to accompany them, and Annie was the one on this trip. So she was explaining to me what happened as they flew into community to community with these government consultants revamping elder care. And elder care, they were trying to restructure to take place in the home. What was interesting was Annie had this odd, a lot of elders speak in a sort of a circuitous way when they use English. And she had this way of saying, I knew it would happen. This is how she said it to me. I knew it would happen, but I didn't know where. She said this as she was telling me the story. And it was a bit frustrating, because it was a 20-minute story. I'm not going to make you listen to it for 20 minutes. And she said, I wasn't sure when it would happen, but I knew it would happen. And then she kept going, and then we flew into this place, and then this place, and it didn't happen. And then we flew into this place. It didn't happen there either. And I'm going, what didn't happen? You know. And she says, and finally we flew into Chesterfield Inlet, and then it happened. I'm like, okay, well, what happened? And she said, we flew into Chesterfield, and there was a community meeting like this, a room full of Inuit, and at the back, one of the Inuit said, you're asking us, as the government, to change, that you want to change community care to make it more suitable for Inuit. Now, the phrase you've given us in this paper says Inuit home and community care. So since English is our second language, and Annie said this was the secret plot, she said this is the plan. It was a little trap for the government that the Inuit had prepared. And it happened in Chesterfield, the trap. She said, the phrase Inuit home and community care, do you mean that's for Inuit, or that's in the Inuit way? And she said the government person fell into the trap and said, oh, no, of course. That's community care for elders in the Inuit way. And then all the Inuit in the room relaxed and sat back and said, oh, good, that's great. And there was a big sigh, and everybody settled, and the government person looked around with real concern. What did I do? What did I say? What did I commit to? What's going on? And Annie said, oh, you just expanded this much bigger than you thought. And the government person said, why? What did I commit to? I said, well, there's a lot of white people in our communities. They've been living amongst us for years, and we feel responsible for them. And if it's community care for Inuit, we wouldn't be able to look after them. But if this is funding potentially $200-300 million, and we're allowed to do it in the Inuit way, we're going to look after the older white people too, because that's the Inuit way. And you've just said we're allowed to do that. So you're going to be spending a lot more money than you planned, because we're going to look after the white people too. That was an example of one of like a myriad of lessons that happens when you're working in Inuit contexts. For me, I don't recall ever having a conversation of that kind of nuance and depth that showed me that a whole group of people understood or had a certain type of feeling of protective ethic beyond their own group, and that it wasn't something imposed or a written policy. It was just a natural part of how they felt they ought to behave. This was wonderful, but it was only one of many of these kinds of examples. The other thing that Annie said that I found really helpful in that first year I worked with her is she kept asking, why did white people think we could own pieces of the Earth's surface? Like, what was wrong with us? She said, you know, when you first arrived here around in the 1950s in mass, you know, after World War II, we kept trying to tell you, you can't take a piece and say that it belongs, any more than you can cut a piece out of the air or the water. Like, that's obvious, right? I mean, do white people get that? I mean, we think you do, but you don't seem to, because you still keep, like, making lines and putting these pieces of metal in the ground and then building houses and say that doesn't belong to us anymore, or we can't use it because it now belongs to a white person. And this is where we've lived for 15,000 years. So do you really, really believe that this belongs to you now? And we finally realized that white people really did think this. And the only way we were going to be able to protect this land was we were going to have to actually talk like you and make a land claim to this land, which we shouldn't ever have to do. And we had to fight for a land claim. But we shouldn't have to do that. It's that we realized you didn't understand that this can't belong to single members of a species. So we've had to negotiate a land claim. We never wanted to. It's that you didn't understand. And so we had to learn how to talk like you and do this. So that was probably one of the other major lessons for me from Annie. And it kind of captures something that a line that Oren Lyons uses a lot when he speaks. He says, what you call resources, we call relatives. And you hear this it's very common. There's actually expressions in Nishnabeg and Lakota, and you hear them translated if you go to ceremonies, Lakota and Nishnabeg ceremonies. And you've probably seen this or seen it written, heard. It translates into English. Almost all major ceremonies start with some kind of expression that says, all my relations. And when they say all my relations, this isn't merely cousins, uncles, humans. All my relations means valleys, mountains, insects, sky, water, buffalo, polar bears, animals, plants, wind. This is all my relations. It's a widely encompassing sense of responsibility that prefaces most events and announcements or major get-togethers. And so that allows, let me put a point on that with William Commanda. William Commanda died a couple of years ago. He was one of the longest-lived chiefs in Canada. And William was an Algonquin chief. And in 2001, I happened to be seated next to him at an event at Harvard, actually, in the States. And afterwards, we were on a panel and talking, and I was just a young person, brand new out of all sorts of school stuff, and I was thrown into this situation, and there was this elder I'd heard about, William Commanda. And so wherever he went, while he was on talking and so on, I made it my mission to sit near him and see what happened. This is one of the lessons I've learned whenever you find these wise people. Just try and get as close as possible, and until you're totally annoying and they get rid of you. But if they can tolerate you, stay right in their face as much as possible. And so, he was sitting we were in a B&B where they put us, and we were on an outside patio, and we were having lunch. They'd kind of done this thing at a conference where they give you lunch to eat and coffee and stuff. And he was sitting there. And of course, I was, like right next to him, like watching what he's doing. And because of this, I watched him. He had a cup. And I thought, okay, well, this is ordinary. I'm eating my soup and doing my thing. And then I see him take the cup and he sticks it through this edge of the porch towards one of the plants. And I'm thinking, this looks sort of weird. And I'm wondering what he's doing. So I'm trying not to look obvious and watch what he's doing. And he's sticking it out and he's talking to the cup. I know, sounds odd. And I look, and on the cup, is a spider that's on the rim of the cup, and he's putting it next to the plant. And he's talking. And I wrote down, I tried to be subtle, but I have it written. I actually wrote on a serviette what he was saying. And he wasn't talking to anybody else. He was talking to the spider. And he was saying, "Here you go, brother. You don't really belong here. You belong over there. Why don't you go onto that plant? That's good." And the spider steps off onto the plant. And he brings the cup back. And then he kind of leans over, and he leaned away, so I had to pretend to tie my shoe to lean down so I could hear him. He leans over, and he said, again, none of us busy people in our lives were paying attention. And he just said, very quietly, "That's why the dams are," and he was referring to the hydro dams in Quebec, "that's why the dams are a spiritual crime. They flood the land and they kill the spiders and the ants and the bees, and that's a spiritual crime." And he puts his cup down and he turns back to eat lunch with the rest of us. And that was not his public presentation or any speech he gave. That was something, was him. And it was a really moving moment for me to see or feel the reality and intensity of that. That was no way an affectation or a performance for an audience or anything. It was something done when he thought he was being private. And also that, for me, that he referred to the killing of the ants and bees and spiders through flooding of vast areas of Quebec to create hydropower as a spiritual crime. This, to me, raises the question, because Oren Lyons is referred to as a faith keeper. And these kinds of commitments or levels of interwovenness or responsibility or bondedness that some of these elders embody and refer to, it feels to me as it's a very spiritual effort, or it's a very spiritual attitude. But they don't explicitly very often refer to it as such. What is spiritual or responsible or we might say religious just naturally seems to weave through all parts of life without it having to be denoted as spiritual. So how you build a house, how you prepare food, how you welcome people into your dwelling, how you say goodbye to someone. I mean, all this would have spiritual connotation, but it wouldn't be something explicitly siloed out as a religious activity. And this is important in a way, if we're going to segue now to Fitzgerald and Masuzawa, because they point out that the word religion doesn't exist in any North American indigenous language. It also doesn't exist in Pali, Japanese, or Chinese. Masuzawa actually wrote a book entitled The Invention of World Religions in 2005. But I like her subtitle. Her subtitle is How European Universalism Was Preserved in the Language of Pluralism. And what they write about is how the construction, Masuzawa actually tracks it to a particular period in the 1920s and 30s, where the list of what is a religion and what isn't was made in American colleges and universities. And that's actually how Islam and Buddhism got elevated at that time to be included as religions. But all Native American practices were considered, well, they're very hard to denote and specify a realm that's a religious realm, so they just discarded them. They're not really religions. So they're not included. Which is fine, in a way, because it allows us then to raise the question, maybe this application of the term religion and the siloing of things into these things are religious and these things aren't, is so artificial and harmful and unhelpful that it would be better if we at least questioned it and didn't assume it to be identifying something solid and real and permanent. The other thing that I find helpful about looking at the way religion scholars have studied their field, excuse me, I'm just going to drink a bit here, is they've decided to actually question the terminology they use and how it arose and how universal it is. And that kind of discipline in the religious studies area, particularly by Fitzgerald, Shelbrick, Masuzawa, is admirable. I also think it's missing, maybe, somewhat in the field of education. That the actual establishment of a separatable sphere of learning and teaching that denotes a scarce, special domain in which learning and teaching is going on, and that in the rest of life, learning and teaching is not going on, maybe deserves some challenging. Especially since, again, in most North American indigenous languages, you don't find a separate word for education. It's considered teaching and learning are going on in people's interactions all the time. And there's not necessarily a separate thing. What seems to happen in terms of education as a separatable activity is that it arises as soon as you kidnap adults and put them into wage slavery. As soon as you put adults, grown-ups, away from kids and have to make them earn money and they're not there, we have to have something to do with the kids. And we do get all societies that essentially embrace some type of economized, monetized activity immediately start looking for education as well, or claiming they don't have it, which is quite amazing when you look at UN studies saying, 25 million kids don't have education. Well, what they're saying is 25 million kids don't have schools. They're not saying they don't have education or they're incapable of learning or there's no teaching that goes on in their life. They're saying they don't have schools. And so this peculiar kind of construction as well of education as this, I'm going to jump over to here for a sec, this kind of hydroponic activity that we do. And hydroponic, and I like Wikipedia, it says hydroponic is a growing in a soilless culture. Well, arguably, schools is growing people in soilless cultures. Essentially, they're things we set up anywhere. They're basically the same all around the world. And it's a method for creating a specially distilled serum that you put into each little, like a baby birds, all lined up in age-divided cohorts in cement buildings under fluorescent lights. And we administer the same kind of serum or little food source to them all. And this hydroponic method of teaching and learning we call schooling. And it's a unique thing from the last couple of hundred years. And it's what people claim they don't have when they say they don't have education. They're not suddenly rendered incapable of learning anything, or that there are no elders around who can teach them. It's they don't have cement buildings with age-divided cohorts under fluorescent lights. So this kind of thing is what's missing. I think it's important that the education field may want to sort of pick up some of that self-reflective critique that the religion field has done when they look at the invention of the term and where it came about. I think Madhu Prakash and Gustavo Esteva and Ivan Illich were the only ones who actually tracked the etymology of the word of education and found when it came into use in English, Spanish, and French around the 16 to 1700s. Before that, that word doesn't exist in English or Spanish or French. So that's an aside on the topic of essentially the kind of the extraction of human functions and then creating specialized ways of doing them. And one of the people who made this really understandable for me, I'm going to jump over to him now, if you haven't come across him, is Niels Christie. And in 1977, he wrote a paper in the British Journal of Criminology. A funny place to write it. criminology, and it was called Conflict as Resource. And Niels Christie was on the Norwegian parole board, and he was involved in prison rehabilitation and parole reform. And he noticed that Norwegian society in some ways was deteriorating as the special functions of fairness and adjudicating issues between people and people's ability to deal with conflict was becoming separated out from society and handed over to professional classes, judges, lawyers, police people, social workers, and that conflict was not something people were very comfortable with. That essentially, but he argued, conflict is actually, he said it's like oil or gold, it's a resource. It's a critical part of what a human community uses and engages with as we interact with each other. And we have to have broad-based competency in understanding conflict. We don't agree about everything, but having conflict as something specialized that only certain people can deal with actually incapacitates us and renders us dependent on a special class of people who can fix things. When your neighbor turns up the stereo, you call the police. You don't go next door and, yeah, we're gonna have to have this awkward conversation. Can you turn it down? I know, you know. But there are competencies. It's like social muscle. We have to learn how to deal with these things amongst each other. They're not things we can just separate out. So you see some of the themes here I'm trying to touch on are the spiritual separated out, the learning and teaching separated out, conflict separating out, and essentially kind of crippling us in some broad way. And even despite this kind of specialization and crippling, we still persist in our competencies and abilities. So we're still able to do things. We actually have a lot, you should actually probably say, it's amazing that we're as resilient as we are and able to do what we can amongst each other and help each other, given that we've actually extracted so many human functions and parceled them off into special domains. But this extraction is really apparent for Indigenous scholars. And the one who talks about it the most, if you haven't come across her, I recommend reading her work on it, is Leanne Simpson. She's Anishinaabe lives north of Toronto, Canada, and she writes extensively about extractivism and how the parallels of resource extraction and the extraction of learning and teaching from the community, the extraction of care from the community, all different types of extraction that go on. And for the First Nations people in Canada also, the taking over of these functions and then the monetizing of them, and essentially turning them into things that the dominant white society profits from. And so that's another aspect. So she's very focused on explaining extractivism, and she has very helpful analysis if you have the time to read it. The other metaphor that's really helpful, and perhaps you don't come across it as much here in Finland, but you do come across it if you visit Canadian cities, is the fortress. Canada was colonized by terrified groups of Europeans who built fortresses to protect themselves. So they would go somewhere, put a wall around something, and then be terrified of the local population who they were going to try and trade with. And this fortress mentality, Dwayne Donald, the Cree scholar, has said, essentially kind of infects much of the thinking in Canada and the United States. That even the construction of the self and the way we view human psychology is like a fortress, that you've extracted yourself from your natural environment and you're somewhat at war with it, and you've got a wall around you. And you have to kind of negotiate with the human environment, or sorry, the natural environment, and protect yourself from incursion or threat. And the environment is just naturally threatening. Donald's is education scholar, actually, and he says, we've constructed our education this way, in Canada anyway, and we think the ideal is to create citizens, individual atomized citizens that are actually all little mini fortresses. And we all kind of move around the world, bumping into each other like bumper cars, you know, and essentially trying to negotiate as little atomized selves. So this is his metaphor for what's happened in the Canadian education system. And instead of any real openness to relationality and understanding how we relate to each other. So those were the main points I wanted to make moving through this little matrix here. Maybe with one slightly we can turn towards the light here, and with not such a pessimistic picture. But a couple of years ago, Naomi Klein was giving a talk at Concordia University in Montreal, and in the Q&A, she was asked a question in which she answered, and again, scribbling down, it was a great answer, and so I wanted to repeat it here in this context. And she said, what the corporations and government want to convince us are infinite are the resources, oil, forests. They try to convince us these things are infinite, but they're not, they're finite. But the things they're trying to convince us are finite are care, our ability to look after each other, our concern. Those things are infinite. We can care. But the posture of the corporate and government view is that these things are scarce and can run out, and therefore we have to be, we can't trust each other, we can't rely on each other, we can't help each other. We need instead to build little fortresses and protect ourselves against each other. She said, we have to work against that lie. That's a lie. It's not true. And we have to flip that. And that's our work. So now I'm going to segue around to the Buddhist side of the equation here. Let's get some Buddhism in. Why not? One of the things that gets a bad rap in Buddhism and doesn't get talked about very much is the word anatta. And the reason it does, it's one of three main ideas in Buddhism: impermanence, suffering, and non-self is how that gets translated. But I think, especially after Raisa's presentation, we have to talk about what non-self really means. It doesn't mean nihilism, and it doesn't mean extinction of an ego or anything like that. As one of my teachers used to say when we got to this section of our curriculum and studying anatta, he said, all that means is that the self is not separate, it's not permanent, and it's not inherent. He said, any more than a chair. You know, we have a wooden chair. Okay, it's not separate, it's not permanent, it's not inherent. This thing wasn't here 100 years ago. It probably won't exist in this form 100 years from now. Neither will this thing, right? But it doesn't mean you can't work with the idea and concept of chair. It's not suddenly chairs don't exist. It's that they're not permanent, not separate, not inherent. The other thing my teacher used to say was he would challenge us in our meditation class. He'd be sitting and nonchalantly, and then he would say, all right, when exactly did the chair become the chair? Was it when the tree was cut down? Was it when the legs were put on? At what point does it start becoming a chair? And then at what point in time does it specifically stop being a chair? When the leg falls off? All legs fall off? It's very hard to delineate a specific end and beginning to phenomena. And this kind of flow to phenomena, including us, you know, where did we specifically become? There's no period on this sentence. and there's no beginning point. There's a flow. And so it's when we talk about relationality, we're talking also about relationality through time, not merely through space. That there aren't separate selves that we cut out of the fabric of reality. I say this because one of the really negative words that gets used in Buddhist contexts is detachment. And my meditation teachers would get a little frustrated and say, you can't be detached. If you want to be detached, resist gravity. Don't breathe. You're attached. You're attached to oxygen. You're attached to the planet. There is attachment. The problem is when we're blindly clinging to particular outcomes, we cling, that causes suffering. Attachment is just part of the nature of phenomena. We're interwoven with everything. We can't not be. The view that we are is back to Dwayne and Leanne, this extracted fortress mentality that the European view in Canada, at least, has kind of imposed and created this artificiality in the way we function. It's not real. It's not true. When we would go on meditation retreat for months in silence, our teacher would say things like, no one does a meditation retreat. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I just did one. And then he would say, no, you're not listening to me. And then he would write it on the board, and he would go, no one does. He said, there is no one that does a meditation retreat. And you have to, and there is no one that ever gets enlightened. He says, in the whole history of humanity, no one ever gets enlightened. This is a group project. It's a collective, interwoven, unfolding experience. If people successfully kind of have some kind of spiritual attainment, it's because they recognize and are folded into this web, vast web, not because they've made some kind of accomplishment that separated themselves from nature or humanity. So that idea that there is no one is perhaps best illuminated by an exercise that one of my meditation teachers gave. And I'd like you to think about it right now. When we were training in Buddhist seminary school, near the end of the training, we were offered the opportunity, if we wanted, to take various levels of ordination. And some people, along with that, were given robes. But one of the exercises that one of the teachers gave before that happened was he said, I'd like you to take a white robe material, not the red, but take a piece of white robe material. And the whole class will take that robe material. And we're going to meet tomorrow morning, and everyone bring a Sharpie. And then you can get together, and in the morning, we're going to start. And on the edge with a Sharpie, you write the people who most inspired you in your spiritual path to start with, who got you interested in being involved in spiritual work. Next, I want you to write the names of the people who most inspired you in terms of the arts, in terms of thinking more broadly and creatively. Who are the poets who've inspired you? The novelists? What's the music that's most inspired you? What are the scientific inventions you think have been most pivotal in your life that you've understood, that you've depended on? Who are the family members who've been the most inspirational to you? Who are your mentors? And you can take a week to do this until you've filled in this entire robe. And then when you're done, you're going to meditate with that around your shoulders and think about the fabric of your experience and how interwoven you are with all sorts of influences. He didn't do it in that exercise, but if this was Oren Lyons giving this exercise, I'm sure he would have added the valleys and mountains that influenced you, the spaces that influenced you. I think of that more being here because so many Finns have been talking about how the physical environment affects their attitude, psychology, way of being. But imagine writing all that onto a robe, and then that becomes your practice, is to practice with that, and to try and live up to that, or make that part of the way we express and interact with each other, with that kind of broad history behind us, and the idea too that it's not finished, that you would keep adding to that robe, you know, through these kinds of interactions. It just keeps going. And that's why I think I get a little miffed when I go to the federal government office in Inuktitut, and there's about 85% white people working there, non-Inuit. And it used to be, they actually got rid of this, but it used to be that there was a person working there, I was amazed at this, who had one of these tags. And the title on their tag was Director of Inuit Development. And I always thought to myself, I don't think it's the Inuit that need developing. I really did feel, as I interacted with these, and I still do, my friends are from up north, and I get the opportunity to go and interact with people in different First Nations contexts in Canada, that the folks that are kind of, let's say, more of a somewhat lower down on the evolutionary scale sometimes, are my peeps, white people. I've said before that it sometimes feels like studying how white people behave is a bit like looking at a civilization that was given the keys to Dad's car and is screaming around the parking lot doing donuts and burning up gas like crazy and throwing beer cans out the window. And that's my civilization. And then I go to hang out with elders and First Nations, and they kind of look gently and slowly and say, you know, when are you folks going to join the rest of us? You know, and essentially figure out what's going on. 40,000 years of civilization has been indigenous. The civilizations that have been on this planet have lived, by and large, I'm not saying they were perfect. They didn't, you know, have wars and whatever, but they've largely lived in some type of harmonious relation with their natural environment. It's only the last couple hundred years, last 400 years, we've had this new thing, non-indigenous civilization. It's really an aberration. It's unusual. And it's largely only possible because of fossil fuels. I don't think it has, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't hold out necessarily a lot of hope that this form of civilization is going to be here for 300-400 years or more. I certainly can't see it being something that lasts 40,000 years. So if we're going to have civilizations in the future, presumably they're going to end up having to be something like indigenous civilizations again, that are in some type of harmonious relation with our environment. Otherwise, we won't go on. And that seems to be the sort of the lesson from the older sisters and brothers in the room, the older civilizations, as they look at us, and they must wonder why magazines on National Geographic and so on put pictures of indigenous people on the cover, because indigenous people aren't that interesting or different. They're the norm. It's white people that are different. This is new. And I mean, this is a weird kind of creation that we do what we do. And it doesn't show a lot of great signs of being around for a long time. So with that in mind, I'll leave it at that and say, if you ever get a chance to go to a thrift store, or what you may have as the equivalent in Finland, and make yourself a robe, I hope you do, and you get a chance to write down all the people who are your mentors and inspirations in the arts and philosophy and spirituality, and make it part of how you might conduct a spiritual practice that isn't severed from the way you interact and do all the normal things in life. Food preparation, the way we welcome people into our homes, the way we travel across the land. All these should have some kind of sacred component and not have necessarily the sacredness confined to 1 day a week done inside a building somewhere by some man with a white collar. Anyhow, that's a plea for the reintegration of sacredness and the non-separateness of it. So, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Questions?
Yeah. You're gonna erase this or leave it up. I could leave this on? Okay. But we should have questions for you too, right? Yeah. Questions for you too.
No questions for me because I didn't leave time for questions for me because I'm sure that all the other presenters will answer during these 3 days for your questions. So
Okay.
you know.
Right. Any questions, complaints, criticisms?
Yes.
Things
so
I
I
left
have a
out?
microphone for.
Yeah. None.
Welcome to Finland.
I put them to sleep with my monotone voice.
Yes. Okay. There is one. Yes. Okay.
Okay, I'm Risto Moisi. I come from a small farm in Finland. And notice we are a bit similar to Inuits and so on in our relation to nature. So, for instance, in the old days, everything was used and nothing was wasted, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and I think there are strong similarities between rural, agrarian, or agricultural cultures and nomadic hunting cultures. They have this similar feelings of obligation and interaction with the land and understanding of the natural environment. Yeah, and I think that what the difference now is the shift. At least in Canada, where we have 90% of the population now lives in urban environments. And I mean, if you take a string 100 yards long and draw a circle around most Canadians, they're probably only surrounded by 5 or 10 species on any average point. So in terms of our interactions or understanding of how interspecies we're involved with, especially in a concrete environment, it's pretty limited compared to an agricultural upbringing or a sense of the activities and responsibilities you would have grown up with. But my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but I got the sense that is there a higher percentage of the population in Finland is still rural, or no? Okay, it's pretty. Okay, so it's pretty concentrated in cities here too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had one question. Thank you very much for the very thought-provoking presentation. We have already heard this afternoon some criticism or some kind of problematization of these dualisms, or how should I say, polarizations of concepts, and I totally agree with that. And I was just thinking of your a few concepts that you used in the end of your presentation. I mean, the distinction between the indigenous and non-indigenous cultures or civilizations, and I think that we all, in some way, do understand what does it mean, but in a way, I am some kind of professional philosopher. In a way, it always seems to me that that distinction also is some kind of a modern phenomenon, perhaps. Or how do you see the issue?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's in a way it's a trope, or we use it, but certainly indigenous people don't refer to them until they're forced to. Don't refer to themselves as indigenous. They're just the people from a particular place. And in fact, there's some controversy about the use of the word indigenous in United Nations context and so on, because it's hard to nail down, and it is a modern concept, exactly. And I think that's a worthwhile point to hold. I use it because it's a simple way of having a conversation like this, but it does obscure certain things that probably need to be made clear. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. I would like to hear your opinion on the trend here in Finland. People say in the government and so on that we don't have the resources to let people in sparsely inhabited areas in Finland. We don't have the resources.
I've always felt like these choices about the use of resources are kind of a stacked deck. The question is set ahead of time by where resources go, so that what's left over is a limited amount for particular causes. Let's say how much the military budget gets is so much, and how much the urbanization budget gets, and various other things. And then what's left is, oh, we don't have enough to do this. If we had wanted to do, if you want to do it, we can do it. And it's actually not a question of resources. It's a question of will and interest. It's not a question of resources. It's that this issue doesn't hold enough importance amongst powerful people, and that it's not their importance. And so they choose not to put resources to it. But I remember having this debate when the US was invading Iraq for the first time. And one of my meditation teachers was debating another meditation teacher and saying how terrible that was. And the second teacher said, well, imagine all that effort, the logistics, the fuel, moving 100,000 men, and food for them, and water, and toilets, and aircraft, and all this across an ocean in order to go into a desert and attack somebody. Now, just see all the logistics of that. Now, he said, now imagine all that effort, that human ingenuity, the inventiveness and everything, going in a completely different direction for some other purpose. There's nothing like a law of gravity that says it has to go this way. It's not like it's a law of physics that there's no possible other way those resources could be used. It's just that's a human choice, that we're choosing to do that. And we could choose to take all that human ingenuity and logistics and effort and care and concern and food and water and turn it in a different direction. And I think that applies to issues of whether we support rural communities, what we do with our resources in various ways. There's no law of gravity, there's no fixed thing. I mean, that's what we tend to be given the impression, that this is an absolutely irresistible choice. There is no choice. We can't do that. Well, that's completely wrong, actually. I think what there is then a battle to fight within the parameters of the debate, because they fix them a certain way, as well as outside of the parameters of debate. So anytime we're doing tactics and strategy, we consider what battles we can win, let's say to protect or preserve rural communities within the kind of economic mindset, but we don't limit ourselves to that because the deck is stacked against us usually in that. So I would say we have to have both, because you can't just cede the territory entirely and not make pragmatic arguments. So you make those kinds of arguments as well as fight outside of the parameters of debate. Both areas need fighting when there are causes we're interested in that are not the causes or the issues taken up by the dominant sector of a society, I think. Yeah.
Okay, one short question and short answer.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
Let's see if this can be short. I want to share an idea and see what do you think. about. It just popped up to my head, this idea. Like the situation is that we have some indigenous people, but you're born into it, to these indigenous nations. You cannot really join them if you're not born into them. That's my...
No, that's not necessarily true.
Is it not?
No, in the Inuit land claim, there are committees, and if a person behaves in an Inuit way, conducts himself, learns the language, they're enrolled into the Inuit land claim as Inuk, even if they were born white. And that's unusual. The nation states in Canada and the US have tried to create a blood measurement, but that's a really retrograde and fascist way to control a population, is through blood measurement, and it's really questionable. But that's what our governments have imposed on Indigenous people, so you're right. But the Indigenous people themselves have negotiated their own resistance to that and said, we choose to be able to pick who's in our community. It's up to us to choose. It's not for the government to tell us who belongs. If this person, we consider them part of our community, they contribute as such, we recognize them as one, they are one.
Right.
Sorry, but
Thank you.
just
That
to
was
correct
a good question, because that's Inuits in Canada.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the Inuit in Canada conduct themselves that way. It's one of the only clan claims I know of in Canada, maybe the world, that does that, but they do it that way. And I think that's actually enlightened and, that's a humane and correct way for them to do it. Thanks.